The desert did not announce him. It swallowed him whole, the way it swallowed everything that fell into it, and for 3 full days Arrakis simply digested the wreckage without comment. It began with a wrongness in the sky that no navigator's almanac accounted for. A tear of violet light unspooling above the Habanya Erg like a wound that refused to close, folding space back on itself in a shape the Spacing Guild's most sacred mathematics had no name for. The Guild felt it before anyone else did. Deep in their tanks of orange spice gas, the navigators who steered highliners across the black gulfs between stars convulsed as one, their prescient sight snapping toward a point in space-time that should not have existed, a door where no door had been cut. For an instant, every highliner in transit through the Arrakis system shuddered in its own wake, engines screaming against a current that was not there a heartbeat before, and was gone a heartbeat after. Then it passed, and the folded space pilots of the Guild returned to their duties with the peculiar, deliberate silence of men who have seen something they will spend decades trying not to think about. On the ground it looked like a falling star. A Harkonnen patrol out of Carthage saw it first. 6 men in a ground car skimming low over the lee side of the Cielago Depression, hunting smugglers who'd gone to ground with a cache of contraband spice. The younger of them, a boy named Vesk, barely 2 years into his uniform, was the one who spotted the light. It came down wrong. Not the long burning arc of a ship losing atmosphere, not the tumbling scatter of meteor debris. It came down like something had been thrown, hard, by a hand large enough to throw a mountain, and it struck the sand a half-kilometer from their position, with a sound that was not an explosion so much as a note, a single deep bass tone that Vesk felt in his sternum before he heard it in his ears, and that left the sand around the impact site fused to black glass in an uneven halo 40 meters across. The patrol captain, a scarred veteran named Iakin Nefud, who had buried better men than himself in worse holes than this one, gave the order to advance with weapons drawn and lasguns set to stun, because whatever had come down out there, it wasn't a smuggler's skiff, and it wasn't a downed ornithopter, and Nefud had survived 15 years on Arrakis by assuming the worst about anything he didn't recognize. They found the crater first, a shallow bowl of glass and scorched basalt, steam still curling off it into the cold desert night, the twin moons throwing pale double shadows across the wreckage scattered at its center. Twisted black metal, none of it matching any hull plating Nefud had ever catalogued. And in the middle of it, upright, unmoving, stood a shape that made 3 of the 6 men raise their lasguns without waiting for the order. It was not human in scale. Nearly 7 feet of black armor played over black cloth, a cape hanging in tatters from one shoulder where the fall had torn it, a chest panel set with small colored lights blinking in slow, patient rhythm. And the sound Vesk had felt before he'd heard the impact, was still going. A slow mechanical rasp, in and out, steady as a metronome, the breath of something that had not stopped breathing since long before it fell out of the sky, and did not intend to stop now. The head turned toward them, not the frantic, disoriented movement of a survivor, a slow, deliberate rotation, the black mask's amber-red lenses finding each of the 6 men in turn, cataloging them the way a man might catalog insects before deciding whether they were worth the effort of crushing. "You will lower your weapons," the voice said, and it came from somewhere behind the mask's vertical grill, mechanical and vast and utterly without hurry, "or you will not need them again." Nefud had faced down smugglers with nerve disruptors, and once, memorably, a rogue Fremen war party in the deep Erg, who had come at his patrol with crysknives, and a contempt for lasgun fire that should have gotten every one of them killed, and somehow hadn't. He had never in 15 years felt what he felt now, a cold certainty settling into his gut that the 6 lasguns pointed at this thing were, for reasons he could not articulate, exactly as useful as pointing them at the desert itself. He gave the order to fire anyway. It was his duty, and whatever else Iakin Nefud was, he was a man who did his duty. The bolts came fast, 6 streams of blue-white energy converging on the black-armored figure from every angle at once, and stopped, not deflected, not absorbed. Stopped, hanging in the dark air a meter from the figure's outstretched palm, frozen mid-flight like insects caught in amber, humming with contained violence that had nowhere left to go. The figure's other hand rose in a slow, almost lazy gesture, fingers curling, and Vesk watched, would remember for the rest of his life, however short that turned out to be, as the frozen bolts of energy simply reversed, snapping back along their own paths faster than they'd come, and 3 of his patrol dropped where they stood, and did not get up. The 3 who remained, Nefud among them, did not run. To their eternal foolish credit, they held their ground, because running from a thing like this felt, on some animal level, like an insult it might not forgive. Interesting, the figure said, and took a step forward, and the glass crunched under a boot, heavier than any boot should be. This is not a technology I recognize. No shields, no deflector arrays. A pause, filled entirely by that patient mechanical breath. And yet you fired directly at me, as though you believed it would matter. Either you are very brave, or your commanders have taught you nothing about the things that come out of the dark. Nefud found his voice from somewhere. What are you? I have been called many things. The mask tilted, considering the question with what might, in a human face, have passed for mild curiosity. Where I come from, they call me Darth Vader. Where I am now, the hand that had reversed the lasgun bolts flexed once, slowly, testing something invisible in the air around it, testing a force that had followed him across whatever gulf had swallowed him whole and delivered him here, intact, undiminished, exactly as it had always answered him. I have not yet decided what they will call me. That will depend on what I find here worth ruling. He looked past the 3 surviving soldiers, out across the moonlit dunes rolling to every horizon, at the strange double shadows, and the bitter cold air that reeked of something sharp and cinnamon-sweet he did not yet have a name for, and at the far ridge where, unseen by any of them, a Reverend Mother's prescient dream had jolted her awake 3 nights running with an image she could not parse, a black shape standing amid fire, and behind him, a red door opening onto an ocean of sand. Take me to whoever commands here, Vader said. I would prefer to begin with civility. I am equally prepared to begin otherwise. Baron Vladimir Harkonnen received the news the way he received most disruptions to his comfort, reclining on his suspensor couch, several fingers deep into a bowl of Tirmiz melon, irritation curdling into interest only when the words cannot be killed, and stop the lasgun fire in the air reached his small, sharp eyes. Bring him to Carthag, the Baron said, after a silence long enough that his physician attendant Peter de Vries began to fidget. Alive, obviously. One does not discard a curiosity of this magnitude before determining its price. He popped another sliver of melon into his mouth, chewed with slow satisfaction, and allowed himself, for just a moment, to imagine what a weapon that could stop energy bolts mid-flight might be worth to a great house locked in a slow, grinding war of attrition with House Atreides over the spice fields his family had bled Arrakis for across 3 generations. And Peter, send word to no one else. Not the Guild, not the Emperor's man Fenring, sniffing about as he does. If this thing is what the patrol claims, I want to know its price before anyone else in the Imperium learns it exists to be bought. It was, Peter de Vries reflected privately, exactly the kind of decision that had kept House Harkonnen wealthy, and exactly the kind of decision that would, eventually, get every last one of them killed. He said none of this aloud. He simply bowed and went to arrange transport for a 7-foot armored stranger who had, according to 3 terrified witnesses, made lasgun bolts fly backward through the air by wanting them to. They brought him to Carthag under heavy guard that both sides understood to be theater. 6 armored troop carriers, 40 men, 2 mobile shield generators trundling along at walking pace, all of it arranged around a prisoner who walked, unbound, unhurried, at the center of the formation like a king touring an honor guard, rather than a captive being escorted to judgment. He had asked, once, with a patience that unsettled Nefud more than any threat could have, whether they intended to bind his hands. When told it had been considered and abandoned as pointless after what the patrol had witnessed, he said nothing further, and simply walked, cape torn and dragging faint furrows in the sand, through a landscape of ochre dunes and heat shimmer that was, in its total alien vastness, unlike anything even Coruscant's endless architecture had prepared him for. He noted the shield generators without comment, noted, too, the way the soldiers around him kept a precise, unvarying distance, not close enough to be caught in a strike, not so far as to look like a retreat. Professional men, trained men, afraid in a controlled and disciplined fashion that spoke of a command structure with teeth. Good. He had spent more than 2 decades of his life inside an empire built on fear, disciplined into obedience. He recognized its architecture instantly, the way a man recognizes his own house's floor plan in the dark. What he did not recognize, what needled at him with the persistent low-grade irritation of a puzzle refusing to resolve, was the total, absolute silence where the Force should have shown him the currents of this place. On his own galaxy's worlds, even primitive ones, the Force moved through life and death and violence in patterns he had learned to read before he had learned to walk in armor. Here, it was present. He could feel its pressure at the edges of his awareness, could feel that this desert, of all deserts, sat somehow closer to something vast and old than any world he had walked before. But the patterns were wrong, foreign, as though the Force itself did not yet know what shape to take on a planet that produced a substance capable of bending the perception of every mind that consumed enough of it. He filed the observation away, the way he filed every observation, for use later. He had not yet decided whether this world's substance, this spice the soldiers spoke of in low, reverent, frightened tones, that scented every breath of air here with a cinnamon-sharp burn, was a threat to him or a tool waiting to be claimed. He intended to find out before he committed to either conclusion. They reached Carthage as the second sun was climbing, the city rising out of the heat shimmer like something built by men who had made an uneasy peace with a planet that wanted them dead. Squat fortress architecture, heavy shielding, streets scoured smooth by decades of wind-blown grit. Baron Harkonnen received him in a hall built for intimidation, high-ceilinged and cold despite the desert heat outside, suspensor lights throwing hard shadows across a floor of dark stone. The Baron did not rise from his couch. He had learned, across a long and cruel life, that the appearance of unconcern was itself a weapon, and he deployed it now with the same confidence he'd have shown a rival Landsrad noble. So, the Baron's small eyes traveled the length of the black armor with open, undisguised appraisal, the way a merchant appraises livestock. You are the thing my men found in a crater, breathing like a dying man and killing 3 of them with their own weapons. A slow, oily smile. I am Baron Vladimir Harkonnen. This is my world, or a considerable and profitable portion of it, whatever the Emperor's ledgers claim. And you, I am told, have no name that means anything here. I have a name, Vader said, and something in the mechanical flatness of it made even the suspensor lights seem to dim, though nothing had changed. It means a great deal, in the place I ruled before your desert swallowed me. You will learn its weight in time, Baron, one way or another. For now, the mask tilted, and Piter de Vries, watching from the shadows at the edge of the hall, felt his physician's instincts scream a warning he did not yet have words for. I would prefer to understand the shape of the board before I decide which pieces are worth moving. The Baron laughed, a wet, rolling sound, genuinely delighted. A diplomat, then, under all that armor. Good. I can work with diplomats, he gestured, expansive, toward the map spread across a nearby table, the spice fields, the Landsrod holdings, the thin red lines marking House Atreides' incoming fleet, still weeks from planetfall, and the black eye of Imperial attention represented by a small, unassuming sigil in the corner that even the Baron's cartographers rendered smaller than it deserved. The mark of House Carino, and beneath it, smaller still, the private seal of a man named Fenring, who missed nothing that happened anywhere in this empire, and who would, within the week, hear rumors of a black giant who stopped bolts in the air with an open hand. Sit with me, the Baron said, and let us discuss what a man of your particular talents might be worth to House Harkonnen. I suspect it is considerably more than the price of a crater full of scrap metal. Vader did not sit, but he did not leave either, and in the space of that stillness, in the patient, unhurried breath filling that cold stone hall, the first thread of an unraveling that would, within a season, reach the golden lion throne itself, had already begun to pull loose. The Baron's hospitality, Vader came to understand within the first hour, was a kind of siege conducted with wine and soft furniture instead of artillery. They had given him quarters, vast by the standards of a captive, appointed with hangings in the deep purple and ochre of House Harkonnen, a table already laid with fruits and meats no desert world had any right to produce in such abundance. He did not eat. He stood instead at the room's narrow window, looking down across Carthag's scoured rooftops toward the haze of heat where the city gave way to open desert, and considered, with the patience of a man who had spent 20 years learning to think inside a mask that never let him breathe freely, exactly how much of this game he intended to play before he stopped playing it on the Baron's terms. Peter de Vries came to him an hour before the promised audience, ostensibly to inquire after his comfort. Vader recognized the errand for what it was before the Mentat had finished his second sentence. A probe, sent to read whatever could be read from a captive too dangerous to threaten directly. "You have questions," Vader said, without turning from the window. De Vries's thin smile did not waver, though something behind his eyes flickered. The particular unease of a man whose profession was reading other men, confronted with a subject who gave nothing away, and yet somehow always seemed to know he was being read. The Baron is a generous host to those who prove useful to him, and considerably less generous to those who do not. I merely wish to help you understand which category you might fall into, before the audience makes the question formal. "You are a Mentat," Vader said. It was not a question. He had gathered the word from the soldiers' low conversation on the march to Carthag. A human computer, they called it, bred and trained to a kind of calculation that this empire's ban on thinking machines had made necessary. He found the concept almost quaint. His own galaxy had built droids and AI cores by the billion, and none of them, in his experience, had ever produced a mind half so brittle as the one standing before him now, radiating a confidence it did not entirely feel. "You have already calculated what I am worth!" "You are here to see whether I confirm or contradict the number." De Vries's composure slipped, fractionally, and recovered. "You are perceptive. I have spent a great deal of my life surrounded by men who calculate my worth and hide the sum from me until it suits them to reveal it." The mask turned, finally, and the amber lenses fixed on the Mentat with an attention that made de Vries's carefully cultivated stillness falter for the first time. "I would advise you not to imagine yourself more skilled at the game than the men I have already outlasted." He let the silence that followed do the rest of the work, and de Vries, a man who prided himself on reading the smallest tremor in another's voice, withdrew from the audience with considerably less to report to his Baron than he had hoped to gather, and a great deal more unease than he cared to admit. The formal audience convened at dusk in the same cold stone hall, with a larger and more carefully arranged court than the Baron had troubled to assemble for the first meeting. House Guard captains, 2 Landsrad trade factors visiting on spice business, and, seated near the back in unassuming Harkonnen livery that fooled absolutely no one who understood the true texture of power in this empire, a slight, unremarkable man with weasel-quick eyes who had arrived from Kaitain 3 days prior on business he had described, with careful vagueness, as an audit of spice output projections. Count Hasimir Fenring did not announce himself as the Emperor's man. He never did. It was, in Shaddam IV court, precisely the point of him, a creature so unremarkable in appearance and so devastating in function that great houses forgot, at their peril, that he was watching until the watching had already cost them everything. He had heard the rumors, of course, a thing fallen from the sky. Lasgun fire turned back on the men who fired it. He had come to Carthag already suspicious that the Baron was concealing something of value from the imperial ledgers, and what he found instead, standing at the center of the hall in torn black armor, with a presence that made even the Baron's suspensor couch seem to shrink slightly in its shadow, exceeded every private theory he had constructed on the 3-day journey from the spaceport. Fenring did not speak the thought aloud. He rarely spoke anything aloud that he had not first turned over from every conceivable angle, a habit that had kept him alive and indispensable through decades of a court built on elegant, patient murder. He watched instead, filing away details with the same Mentat-adjacent precision De Vries had failed to disguise an hour before. The total absence of visible weapons, the way the black-armored figure's presence seemed to press against the room's air like weather, the Baron's oily, overconfident posture that told Fenring, more clearly than any spy's report could have, that his host had not yet understood what he had captured. The Baron opened with an offer dressed as a courtesy. "You will forgive Carthagag's hospitality being somewhat rougher than what you're accustomed to," he said, gesturing to a chair Vader did not take. "I understand you arrived here without allies, without resources, without so much as a change of clothes." A soft, indulgent laugh. "House Harkonnen is prepared to be generous to a man of your evident talents, resources, position, protection from anyone foolish enough to think you an easy target. And I assure you, on Arrakis, there will be those who think exactly that, until they learn better. In exchange, we would ask only that those talents be placed, from time to time, in service of House Harkonnen's interests. You are offering me a leash," Vader said, "and calling it a gift." The Baron's smile thinned by exactly the width of a blade's edge. "I am offering you a place in an empire that does not yet know you exist, Lord Vader, for I understand that is the correct address, from what my men overheard. Without House Harkonnen's patronage, you are a curiosity to be hunted by every faction on this world the moment word spreads, and word will spread, even now." His small eyes flicked, deliberately, toward the unremarkable man seated near the back of the hall, and Fenring met the glance with a bland, unhelpful blink that told the Baron nothing at all. "With it, you are protected, housed, fed, and, in time, should you prove yourself worth the investment, powerful, in ways this desert has not seen since the Emperor's own Sardaukar last marched." Vader considered this for the length of one long, mechanical breath. He had governed men through fear his entire adult life. He recognized the shape of a threat wrapped in the language of generosity as easily as he recognized his own reflection in a viewport. And he recognized, too, the particular arrogance of a man who believed himself the most dangerous thing in the room when the most dangerous thing in the room was standing 4 meters away in torn black armor, entirely unconcerned by the 40 armed men positioned around its edges. "You believe," Vader said, "that you are negotiating from a position of strength, that the 40 men in this hall, and the shield generators outside it, and whatever other force you imagine you could bring to bear, constitute leverage against me." He took a single step forward, and though nothing else in the hall changed, no lights dimmed, no wind stirred, every soldier present felt, in the base of the skull, the same cold animal instinct that had made Sergeant Nefud's patrol hold its ground 3 nights before instead of running. "I have stood in rooms far more dangerous than this one, Baron, surrounded by men whose combined power could have leveled this city from orbit, and left those rooms having killed every one of them who displeased me. You are not offering me protection. You are offering me a cage, dressed in silk, and asking me to thank you for the tailoring." The temperature in the hall did not change, and yet 3 of the Baron's guard captains found themselves, without quite deciding to, taking a half-step back toward the wall. "I did not come to this world to serve a great house's spice ledgers," Vader continued, and his voice dropped into something colder, quieter, more final. "I came to it, however unwillingly, as a man who has ruled greater things than this desert holds, and who does not forget how to recognize a threat masquerading as an ally." The mask tilted, fractionally, toward the Baron's suspensor couch. "Test me again, Baron, and I will demonstrate precisely how little your 40 men and your shield generators would accomplish, before I finish the demonstration by discussing terms with whoever succeeds you." For a long moment, no one in the hall breathed. Then the Baron, who had not survived 4 decades of Harkonnen politics by dying on points of pride, laughed. A wetter, more genuine sound than before, though something behind his small eyes had gone carefully, permanently wary. "Well," he said, "at least we understand each other's opening position." He waved a ringed hand, an old man's gesture of theatrical surrender that fooled no one in the room, least of all Fenring, watching from the shadows with an interest that had sharpened into something closer to alarm. "Then let us discuss it as equals, Lord Vader, and see whether an arrangement can be found that insults neither of our dignities." It was, Fenring reflected, watching the Baron begin the slow work of renegotiating terms he had assumed would need no negotiation at all, the single most interesting thing he had witnessed in this empire in a decade. He rose quietly during the tedious hour of counteroffers that followed, resources discussed, quarters upgraded, the framework of an uneasy and temporary alliance sketched out between a great house and a man who owed it nothing, and slipped from the hall before the audience concluded, already composing, in the private theater of his mind, exactly how he would phrase this to Shaddam IV. "A weapon has fallen out of the sky onto Arrakis, my emperor," he would say, in that careful, oblique way he had of delivering catastrophe, as though it were merely interesting news, "and House Harkonnen believes it has caught it. I am considerably less certain the catching was mutual. 300 kilometers south, in the high stone fastness of a Bene Gesserit way station built into the shield wall's western face, Reverend Mother Gaius Helen Mohayim woke for the fourth consecutive night with the same image scorched behind her eyes, a black shape wreathed in something that was not quite fire, standing before a red door that opened not onto a room, but onto an ocean of sand stretching to every horizon, and behind the door, a presence so vast and so foreign to her sisterhood's long centuries of genetic prescience that her other memory, that unbroken chain of accumulated female consciousness stretching back further than the empire itself, offered her nothing. No memory of him, no echo of his kind in 10,000 years of watching, breeding, and steering the currents of human potential toward the Kwisatz Haderach the Bene Gesserit had spent 90 generations preparing to birth. She sat in the dark of her cell, breathing slowly, and considered, for the first time in longer than she cared to admit, that the careful architecture of a plan 90 generations in the making might have just acquired a variable her order had never planned for and could not yet measure. She reached for a comm unit and began, with hands that did not shake, the long and careful process of alerting the Sisterhood's Council on Wallach 9 that something had entered their board that did not appear anywhere in the game they had spent millennia designing. The arrangement the Baron settled for was, in the end, precisely as uneasy as Vader had intended it to be. He was given quarters befitting a man the Baron could not order about but hoped to eventually own, a private wing of the Carthag garrison, unshielded doors he could open or seal at will, and a standing invitation to observe, from a discreet distance, the operations that kept House Harkonnen's spice wealth flowing. The crawlers work in the deep desert flats, the carryalls lifting off at the first tremor of worm sign, the entire brutal machinery of extraction that had made the Baron's family rich across 3 generations of bleeding this planet for the substance that made interstellar travel possible. Vader watched it all with the flat, assessing patience of a man accustomed to touring conquered territories. He had commanded the resources of an empire that spanned a galaxy. He understood, better than anyone in this hall, what it meant to build wealth on the suffering of a workforce that had no other choice but to labor or starve. What struck him, what he found himself turning over during the long hours the Baron did not yet trust him enough to leave entirely unwatched, was how fragile it all was. One substance, one planet. An entire empire's economy and its faster-than-light travel balanced on the output of worm-infested sand flats that could be disrupted by a single well-placed act of sabotage, and yet no one here seemed to have built the kind of redundant, iron-fisted infrastructure his own empire would have thrown around anything half so valuable. It was, he decided, either an extraordinary weakness or an extraordinary opportunity, and he intended to determine which before he committed himself further to any faction's leash. The spice itself interested him more than he let the Baron's household see. He had, on his second day in Carthag, requested, not asked, requested, in the particular tone that made requests function as commands, a sample of raw melange, ostensibly to satisfy a curiosity about the substance every soldier in this city seemed to speak of with a mixture of hunger and dread. What he did not disclose was the reason beneath the reason that from the moment he had woken in the crater glass, the force around him had felt subtly, persistently wrong, as though the currents he had read instinctively his entire adult life were being filtered through water before reaching him. And he suspected, correctly, though he would not confirm it for some sections yet, that whatever gave this planet's substance its prescient unlocking properties was entangled, in ways his own galaxy's force had no framework for, with the strange pressure he felt whenever he stood beneath Arrakis's twin suns. He did not consume it, not yet. A man who had survived as long as he had, inside a mask that filtered every breath he took, did not ingest an unknown substance handed to him by a captor who had every reason to want him weakened, however useful the captor currently found him. He examined it instead, turned the small ceramic vial in his gloved fingers, extended toward it the same probing attention he might once have turned on an unfamiliar weapon or a captured rebel technology, and felt, faintly, at the very edge of what the Force would show him, something looking back. He said nothing about this to the Baron's household. He filed it, as he filed everything, for later use. Word of the Black Giant reached House Atreides 7 days after the crater cooled, carried not by spies, though Duke Leto Atreides had spies of his own threaded through Carthag's markets and garrison, careful men who reported in code through merchant caravans, but by the much louder and less discreet channel of rumor moving through the spaceport at Arrakis, where dock workers and off-world traders traded the story back and forth until it had grown, in the retelling, from a man who stopped lasgun fire into a demon that ate 3 soldiers whole and wears their bones as armor. Duke Leto received the more sober version, filtered through his own intelligence network, in the map room of what would soon be his new residence on Arrakis, 3 weeks before his house's official transfer of the planetary fief was due to complete. He read the report twice, standing at the long table with his hands braced against its edge, while his old friend and master of assassins, Thufir Hawat, waited with the particular stillness of a mentat, holding several conflicting calculations in careful suspension. A man who cannot be killed by conventional weapons, Leto said finally, currently residing as a guest, or a prisoner, or something in between, neither word quite captures, in Harkonnen custody in Carthag. He looked up. Thufir, tell me this is exaggeration. My lord, I wish I could. Hawat's weathered face carried the particular grimness of a man whose entire profession depended on assessing threats accurately, and who had just been handed one his considerable experience had no category for. 3 independent reports converge on the same account. Soldiers fired on him at close range, the bolts stopped in midair, and were then redirected back at the men who fired them. I have no explanation for how this was accomplished. Not a shield technology I recognize, not a guild-adjacent prescient trick, not anything in the Bene Gesserit's known arsenal, though I have already sent inquiry through our contacts as to whether the Sisterhood might know more than they are currently telling anyone. Leto was quiet for a long moment, looking down at the map spread across the table, the spice basins, the sieches marked in careful cartographer's hand, the thin corridor of desert his house would soon be responsible for governing, defending, and somehow surviving. His son Paul stood near the room's edge, listening with the particular focused attention that had, of late, begun to unsettle his father in ways Leto did not yet have language to voice, as though the boy were not merely hearing the report, but recognizing something in it. "Father," Paul said, when the silence had stretched long enough to invite him into it. "May I ask what the Harkonnens intend to do with him?" "That," Leto said, "is precisely the question that concerns me most, Paul. A weapon like that, in Harkonnen hands, tips a balance our house cannot afford, tipped further against us, before we've even set foot on the planet." He looked to Hawat. "What does the Emperor make of it? Surely Shaddam's people have heard the same rumors we have." "Kaitain has heard," Hawat confirmed. "Count Fenring was in Carthag within the week. No coincidence, I think, that the Emperor's own observer arrived so quickly after the crater cooled. What Shaddam intends to do with the information I cannot yet say. But my lord," and here Hawat's voice dropped into the particular register he used only for his gravest warnings, honed across decades of protecting House Atreides from threats both obvious and subtle, "I would counsel extreme caution in how we approach this matter. whatever this being is. If the Baron has failed to control him, and every report suggests control is precisely what the Baron does not have, whatever agreement they have struck, then we are looking at a factor in this Arrakis transition that answers to no house, no emperor, and possibly no law of physics either House Atreides or House Harkonnen currently understands. Lady Jessica, who had entered partway through the report and stood now near the doorway with the particular Bene Gesserit stillness that gave away nothing of what she was thinking, spoke for the first time. Reverend Mother Mohayim sent word to Wallach 9 4 days ago. Every eye in the room turned to her. The sisterhood's own prescient sight found something they could not parse, a black shape, and a door opening onto sand. Whatever this man is, Leto, the Bene Gesserit's 90 generations of breeding and observation have no category for him either. That should concern all of us considerably more than the question of which house currently claims to be hosting him. Leto absorbed this with the weary, careful patience of a duke who had, in recent months, grown accustomed to inheriting problems his predecessors had left carefully unsolved for him. Then we proceed as we would with any unknown, he said finally, carefully, without provocation, until we understand what provokes him. Thufir, increase our intelligence efforts in Carthage. I want to know everything the Baron learns, as close to the moment he learns it as we can manage. And Paul, he looked to his son, and something in the boy's watchful gray eyes made the Duke pause before continuing. If your training with Gurney and your mother has taught you anything of use in a situation like this, now would be the time to have learned it well. Paul said nothing to this directly. But that night, alone in the chamber that would be his only briefly before House Atreides' own transition to Arrakis was complete, he dreamed, not of the black shape his mother's teacher had seen, not directly, but of sand stretching to every horizon, and somewhere within it, a presence that felt neither ally nor enemy, but something the shape of his own prescient visions had never once tried to draw before, an absence where a future should be, a place in the tapestry of possible tomorrows that simply refused to weave itself into any pattern Paul's growing sight could follow. He woke before dawn with the taste of ash in his mouth, and did not tell his mother what he had seen, because he did not yet have words sufficient to describe a version of the future that ended, for the first time in his short and strange life, in a wall of pure unknowing. Count Fenring's report to Kaitine traveled by the fastest and most private channel available to an Imperial observer of his particular standing, not through the Guild's commercial highliner routes, but aboard a small, unmarked courier vessel whose existence appeared on no manifest and whose pilot had been selected, years before, for a discretion that bordered on muteness. Emperor Shaddam IV Carino received the report in the small audience chamber he preferred, for matters he did not wish recorded in the Imperium's more formal archives, a room of restrained golden opulence, high windows overlooking Kaitane's manicured gardens, and a throne he did not sit upon so much as occupy, the way a large cat occupies a favored patch of sun. A man, the Emperor said slowly, reading Fenring's careful oblique phrasing for the third time, who stopped lasgun fire with an open hand, and who now sits in Carthage discussing terms with the Baron as though he were the one extending patronage. That is, an accurate if somewhat compressed summary, my Lord Emperor. Fenring stood with his hands folded, his small, unremarkable face betraying nothing of the private alarm he had carried across the void from Arrakis. I would add only that the Baron does not appear to fully grasp what he has caught. He believes he is negotiating from strength. I do not believe strength is a category that applies to the two parties in that hall in anything resembling equal measure. Shaddam set the report down with the particular stillness of a man calculating, in real time, whether a piece of news constituted opportunity or catastrophe, and finding the calculation refused to resolve cleanly toward either. The Sardaukar, he said finally, have never faced an enemy they could not eventually break, not the Fremen in their deepest sea etches, not the most fanatical Landsrod rebellion in 3 centuries. If this creature is a threat, my legions will answer it, as they answer every threat to House Carino's throne. With respect, my Lord Emperor, I would counsel against assuming this is a matter the Sardaukar can resolve through their usual methods, until we understand precisely what those methods would be resolving against. Fenring's voice remained level, careful, the voice of a man who had built an entire career on delivering unwelcome truths, in tones so measured his masters rarely noticed how unwelcome the truths actually were. I watched him for the better part of an hour in that hall, my lord. He did not raise his voice. He did not draw a weapon, though I am given to understand he carries one, some manner of energy blade, unlike anything in this empire's arsenals. He did not need to do either. 40 armed men in that room understood, without being told twice, that their presence was a courtesy he was extending them, not a threat he was required to respect. The Emperor was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the tall windows in the gardens beyond, where his daughter's laughter drifted faintly up from some distant courtyard, a sound of ordinary peace that felt, in this moment, oddly fragile. Then what do you recommend, Hasimir? That we watch, for now, rather than act. Fenring's small eyes did not blink. Send no formal delegation, no demand for tribute or fealty that he might feel obligated to refuse in a manner costly to us. Let the Baron continue believing he is the one managing this arrangement, a belief I suspect will prove costly to House Harkonnen alone, and not to the throne, if matters develop as I fear they might. And in the meantime, I would suggest quietly informing the Bene Gesserit that the Empire would value whatever their sisterhood's prescient sight can offer on this matter, given that our own intelligence has produced considerably less than I would like. You believe the witches know something we don't, my Lord Emperor. I believe the witches are considerably more frightened than they are currently admitting to anyone, ourselves included, which suggests to me that they know exactly as little as we do, and understand precisely how dangerous that ignorance might prove to be. On Wallach 9, in the deep stone halls where the Bene Gesserit sisterhood conducted business no outsider was permitted to witness, the Mother Superior Harishka convened an emergency council session with a haste that had not been required in decades. Reverend Mother Mohiam's report sat at the center of the gathered circle of black-robed women, not merely her own account of the recurring vision, but the corroborating testimony of 2 other sisters, whose prescient sight, independently, and without prior communication between them, had produced fragments of the same image, a black shape, a presence like a closed door in the fabric of the future, and, this detail troubled the council more than any other, an absolute silence in the other memory, the accumulated genetic recollection of 10,000 years of Bene Gesserit women, where no memory of anything resembling this figure could be found at all. It is not merely that we have no record of him, said Reverend Mother Mohiam, her ancient voice carrying the particular flatness of a woman working hard to keep genuine fear out of her delivery. It is that other memory itself seems to end at his edge, the way a map ends at the border of unexplored territory. I have walked the accumulated lives of 10,000 years of our sisters, searching for even a distant echo of a power like this, and I find nothing. Not suppression, not concealment, absence, as though he comes from outside the very continuum our sisterhood's genetic memory was built to observe. The Kwisatz Haderach project has run for 90 generations, said another sister, a severe woman named Reverend Mother Aliana, whose voice carried the weight of long institutional certainty, now visibly straining under new pressure. We have bred toward a single bloodline, a single carefully steered outcome, across 3,000 years of patient genetic architecture. If a being of this magnitude has entered our board from entirely outside that architecture, then the board itself may need to be reconsidered, Harishka said, cutting through the rising unease with the particular authority of a woman who had led this sisterhood through crises before and intended to lead it through this one with her composure intact, whatever it privately cost her. We do not panic, we do not act rashly on incomplete information, and we most certainly do not send an emissary to test the voice against a man 3 separate visions have described as a door, until we better understand what happens on the other side of that door should we knock. Her sharp eyes swept the circle. Mohiam, you are already positioned near House Atreides' transition to Arrakis. I want the girl Jessica's reports on this matter prioritized above all else. Her training, and her particular closeness to events unfolding in Carthage through her house's intelligence network may prove more valuable to us than anything our own agents on Arrakis can currently produce. And I want every sister with prescient capacity, however minor, turned toward this question, carefully, in isolation from one another, so that we may compare results, without one sister's fear contaminating another's sight. And if the visions converge again, Mohiam asked, on the same conclusion, that this being represents something our sisterhood's plans did not account for, and cannot yet counter? Harishka's ancient face, for just a moment, showed something that might, in a lesser woman, have been mistaken for doubt. Then we will do what the Bene Gesserit have always done when the board changes beneath us, Reverend Mother. We will adapt the plan. We do not have the luxury of any other choice. In Carthage, unaware of the councils convening in his name across half the Imperium, Vader had begun, on the 9th day of his captivity, that was not quite captivity, a private experiment he had told no one in the Baron's household about. He had requested, and been given, access to a section of open desert beyond Carthage's shield perimeter, ostensibly to acclimate to local conditions, a request the Baron had granted with barely concealed curiosity about what a man in full battle armor could possibly need acclimating to. Alone beneath the brutal weight of Arrakis's twin suns, in air that scraped his suit's environmental systems harder than any world he had walked before, Vader extended his awareness into the Force the way he had 10,000 times before, reaching for the familiar currents of life and death and violence that had never once failed to answer him. They answered, but slowly, thickly, as though moving through something with more resistance than the vacuum of ordinary space, and at the very edge of his perception, faint as a whisper carried on wind from a great distance, he felt again that same sensation he had noted examining the vial of raw spice, the unmistakable sense of being observed by something that existed everywhere and nowhere in this planet's deep sand, ancient beyond his ability to easily measure, and entirely uninterested, so far, in announcing itself further. He did not know, yet, that he was standing above territory a sandworm considered its own. He would learn, within the week, in a manner considerably more dramatic than a vague sensation on the wind, and when he did, the entire fragile arrangement he had built with House Harkonnen would begin, in earnest, to come apart. The worm came at midday, when the heat lay thickest over the open desert and the twin suns had bleached the sky to a pale, merciless white. Vader felt it before he saw it, not through the Force alone, though the Force carried its own warning, a slow gathering pressure like weather building toward a storm, but through the ground itself, a rhythmic percussion rolling up through the sand and into the soles of his boots, growing in tempo the way a war drum grows in tempo before the charge. He had spent 3 days walking this stretch of open desert alone, cataloging its silence, testing the strange thickened currents of a force that answered him slower here than anywhere he had stood before. He recognized, now, that the silence had never been empty. It had been patient. The sand 70 meters to his east began to slump, then boil, then erupt upward in a cascade that threw grit and debris 100 feet into the bleached sky. And out of that cascade rose a shape that made every scrap of Vader's considerable experience with monstrous things. Rancors, wampas, the horrors his own emperor had once kept caged for entertainment and interrogation both, recalibrate in the span of a single heartbeat. It was not simply large, it was geological. A curved, ridged mass of gray-pink flesh armored in overlapping plates, rising and rising until its full height dwarfed even the memory of the largest starship hangar Vader had ever stood inside, and at its crown, where a lesser creature might have carried eyes or a face, there was only a vast circular maw ringed with crystalline teeth, opening onto a darkness that seemed, for one disorienting instant, to swallow the desert's brutal light entirely, rather than merely block it. A sandworm. He had heard the soldiers speak the word in low, superstitious tones, had dismissed the reverence in their voices as primitive fear of a merely large predator. He understood now, watching several hundred tons of ancient flesh rear above him with the unhurried confidence of something that had ruled this desert since long before any empire had thought to claim it, that the soldiers' fear had been entirely proportionate, and his own dismissal had been a mistake he did not intend to repeat. The worm struck. It came down not with a lunge but with the sheer collapsing weight of a falling mountain, an attack that would have erased a starfighter squadron from existence and turned the ground beneath it into a crater visible from orbit. Vader did not run. 20 years of war, of standing in the path of things that should by every reasonable measure have killed him, had built into his bones a discipline that superseded the animal instinct to flee, and in the half-second before that vast weight of flesh and crystalline teeth closed over the patch of sand where he stood, he reached into the Force, thick and reluctant here, sluggish as cold oil, but not absent, never absent, and pushed. The result was not what he expected, and not what the worm expected either, judging by the way its vast bulk shuddered and recoiled, a ripple of confusion passing down its entire colossal length, as several hundred tons of ancient predator found itself, for the first time in perhaps 10,000 years of unchallenged dominance over this desert, physically halted in mid-strike by a force it had no framework for resisting. The push did not throw it back the way it might have thrown back a stormtrooper or a rancor. The worm was too vast, too rooted in the deep, patient physics of this particular world for that. But it staggered, a visible, unmistakable falter, sand cascading off its ridged hide in sheets as it recovered its balance and drew back, the crystalline teeth retracting into that vast dark maw with what might, in a creature capable of such an expression, have been read as something adjacent to surprise. Vader did not wait for it to recover fully. He drew his lightsaber, the first time the blade had ignited on this world, a shaft of pure crimson light snapping into existence with a sound like tearing silk, utterly alien against the bleached white desert glare. And when the worm surged forward a second time, driven now by something that read less like simple hunger and more like affronted territorial rage, he met the strike not with another push but with the blade itself, driven upward into the descending mass of the creature's foremost segment with the full augmented strength his suit's servos could deliver. The blade cut, not through the entire vast bulk. Nothing short of a planetary bombardment was cutting through a sandworm's full mass in a single stroke, but deep, a wound opening along the creature's leading ring in a line of cauterized flesh that sent a shudder of genuine, unmistakable pain rolling back down its length. And the worm recoiled fully this time, retreating in a boiling collapse of sand back into the depths it had erupted from, leaving behind a settling curtain of dust and a silence that felt, in its aftermath, considerably more respectful than the silence that had preceded the attack. Vader stood alone in the crater of displaced sand, breathing in the same slow mechanical rhythm he always breathed in, lightsaber still ignited and throwing its crimson light across a landscape that had, until 3 minutes ago, considered itself the undisputed apex of this world's violence. He deactivated the blade, and for the first time since the crater cooled around him 9 days before, he allowed himself something that was not quite satisfaction and not quite relief, but sat somewhere adjacent to both, the particular grim pleasure of a man who has just confirmed, empirically, that this world's greatest terror was not, in fact, greater than himself. He did not yet understand what he had done. He did not yet know that a wounded, retreating sandworm carried word of its injury through channels that had nothing to do with language and everything to do with the deep, ancient network of territorial awareness that bound every worm in the deep desert into something that functioned, in its way, like a single vast nervous system spanning thousands of kilometers of sand. He did not know that within 3 days every worm within 500 kilometers of the Cielago Depression would carry, at the edges of whatever passed for their awareness, the dim, troubling knowledge that something new had entered their desert and had not, when tested, behaved like prey. And he did not know, could not yet know, standing alone in the aftermath of a fight that would have ended almost any other being who had faced it, that word of the encounter would reach a very particular audience within the week, the Fremen, who read worm sign the way other cultures read written language, and who would receive, from scouts stationed at the edges of the Cielago wastes, a report that did not fit any category their prophecy or their practical experience had prepared them to expect. A man who fought Shai-Hulud and did not merely survive, but wounded the worm and sent it fleeing. among a people whose entire religious and practical existence bent around reverence for the worm god of the deep desert. That report would travel considerably faster and land considerably heavier than any rumor the Harkonnen garrison at Carthage had yet managed to generate. C.H. Tabor received the account 2 days later, carried by a scout named Farok who had been stationed at a watchpost along the Cielago's northern edge and had witnessed the tail end of the encounter through field glasses, close enough to see the crimson blade and the worm's unmistakable retreat, too far to make out anything else with certainty. He delivered his report to Stilgar, the Sietch's naib, in the careful, precise cadence Fremen scouts used for matters of genuine consequence. No embellishment, no superstition dressed as fact, only what the eyes had actually witnessed, because a Fremen who exaggerated worm sign to his naib was a Fremen who got other Fremen killed on bad information. Stilgar listened to the full account twice before he spoke, his weathered face giving away nothing, though something behind his dark, deep-set eyes had gone very still. "A blade of red light," he said finally, and Shai-Hulud drew back from it. "I saw it with my own eyes, Stilgar. The worm struck, he did not run. He struck back, and the worm bled, and fled into the deep sand rather than press the attack a second time." Farok's weathered face carried the particular unease of a man reporting something his entire cultural framework had no ready place to file. "I have watched worm sign my whole life, Stilgar. I have never seen Shai-Hulud retreat from anything." Stilgar was quiet for a long moment, looking out through the Sietch's rock aperture toward the darkening desert beyond, where the twin moons were beginning their slow climb into the evening sky. He thought of the old prophecies the Missionaria Protectiva had planted among his people generations before, prophecies of a Lisan al-Gaib, a voice from the outer world, that his people had half forgotten and half clung to across generations of hard desert survival, uncertain, in the deepest chambers of their own hearts, how literally any of it was meant to be believed. He thought, too, of the more immediate and practical question that concerned a Fremen naib considerably more than any prophecy, whether a being capable of wounding Shai-Hulud and surviving the encounter constituted a threat to his people's water, their Sietch, their hard-won and fiercely guarded survival, on a planet that offered nothing freely to anyone who could not earn it through blood and discipline. "Send word to the other Sietches," Stilgar said finally, quietly. "I want eyes on this man, wherever the Harkonnens are keeping him. I want to know how he moves, how he fights, whether he shows the desert respect or contempt." And Farok, his dark eyes fixed on the scout with the particular weight Stilgar reserved for matters he intended to be taken with total seriousness. "Tell no one outside this siege what you witnessed. Not yet. A story like this, told carelessly, becomes a legend before we have finished learning whether the man beneath it deserves one. I would rather my people know the truth of him before they decide what to worship or what to kill." For 9 days after the worm encounter, nothing happened that could be called a crisis, and Vader found the quiet considerably more useful than any battle would have been. He had not reported the encounter to the Baron's household, and no one had asked. The scattered rumors that eventually filtered back into Carthage's garrison spoke only of unusual worm activity near the Cielago wastes, nothing more specific, and Vader saw no advantage yet in revealing the full shape of what he had done out there alone in the sand. What he had gained from the fight mattered more to him than any reputation it might build. A working understanding, however incomplete, of the terms this world operated on. The Force answered here, slower and stranger than at home, but it answered. His body's strength, his blade, his reflexes, all of it remained intact, exactly as the old iron law of his own nature demanded. Whatever had torn him out of his galaxy and dropped him into this one had cost him nothing but time and orientation, and time, Vader had long ago learned, was simply another resource to be spent with discipline. He used the quiet days to study, not openly. He made a point of appearing, to the Baron's household, no more curious than any captive guest might reasonably be, but with the same patient, methodical attention he had once brought to dismantling a rebellion cell by cell. He listened to the garrison's soldiers talk, absorbing the shape of this empire's politics, the great houses bound in their endless Landsrat rivalries, the spacing guild's stranglehold on travel enforced through its monopoly on folded space, the Bene Gesserit moving through the background of every court like smoke that never quite dispersed. And above all of it, distant and golden and untouchable on a throne at Kaitine, an emperor whose Sardaukar legions were spoken of by every soldier in Carthage, with the specific hushed respect men reserve for a threat they have never personally tested, and hope never to. He found the entire architecture almost nostalgic. He had spent the better part of his adult life inside a very similar arrangement, an emperor at the center, great houses and lesser powers arrayed around him in a permanent, uneasy competition for favor, all of it held together by fear, tradition, and the occasional demonstration of overwhelming force. He understood this game. He had, in fact, once been very good at playing a version of it himself, on the other side of the board, as the iron hand that kept a galaxy's rebellious impulses in check. The question that occupied him now, turning it over during the long hours the Baron's household gave him to himself, was considerably simpler than the Baron or the Bene Gesserit or the distant Emperor yet understood. Not whether he intended to acquire power on this world, but which of its existing structures were worth preserving as a foundation, and which deserved to be swept aside entirely. The Baron, for his part, had begun, cautiously, with the particular greed tempered by fear that characterized every decision he'd made since the audience hall confrontation, to test what his uneasy guest might be persuaded to do in exchange for continued hospitality. A demonstration, the Baron said, over a meal Vader once again did not touch, would go a long way toward settling my house's considerable investment in your comfort, Lord Vader. Nothing so crude as violence against my own people, of course. A soft laugh, oiled with the false warmth the Baron deployed the way other men deployed weapons. But House Atreides arrives within the month to claim this fief from my family. After 90 years of profitable Harkonnen stewardship, stripped from us by an emperor's whim, and a Landsraad ruling, I still consider a personal insult. If your talents were to be seen, merely seen, Lord Vader, nothing more provocative than that, in the vicinity of the Atreides transition, certain conclusions might be drawn by certain parties about the wisdom of accepting a fief that comes with such complications. Vader considered the Baron's careful phrasing with the flat, assessing patience of a man who had heard 1,000 variations of the same request across 1,000 different courts. You wish to frighten House Atreides into abandoning a fief. The Emperor and the Landsraad have already ruled as theirs. I wish, the Baron said, to demonstrate that House Harkonnen's departure from Arrakis need not be as complete or as final as certain parties currently imagine. And you believe I would lend myself to that ambition out of gratitude for a bowl of melon and a room with a view of your fortress walls. The Baron's smile did not waver, though something behind his small eyes flickered with the particular caution of a man who had learned, across 9 days, precisely how little his considerable wealth and power actually weighed in this negotiation. I believe, Lord Vader, that we are both practical men who understand that arrangements of mutual benefit require both parties to occasionally extend themselves. I have extended myself considerably already, Baron, simply by permitting this conversation to continue as long as it has. Vader rose from the seat he had not, in fact, been occupying, and the sheer, unhurried weight of the movement made the Baron's oiled confidence flicker again. I did not come to this world to serve as a threat that frightens rival houses into ceding territory your family has already lost through your own Emperor's judgment. If House Atreides proves, upon my own observation, to be a threat to interests I have decided to protect, I will act against them on my own terms and for my own reasons. I will not act as a mercenary weapon deployed to settle a great house's wounded pride over a lost fief. He left the Baron's hall without waiting for a response, and the Baron, alone now with Peter de Vries, who had watched the entire exchange with his particular mentat stillness, allowed himself, for the first time since the crater cooled, a flicker of genuine, unconcealed worry. He is not a weapon we control, my Baron, de Vries said quietly, once the door had sealed behind Vader's retreating cape. He is a power we are hosting, at his convenience, for reasons of his own that we have not yet fully understood. I would counsel considerable caution before extending this arrangement further. I am aware of the distinction, Peter, the Baron said, more sharply than he intended, popping a sliver of melon into his mouth with hands that were not, quite, as steady as he would have liked. I have been aware of it since the audience hall. The question that concerns me is not whether we control him. It is what he intends to do once he decides he no longer requires our hospitality at all. 300 kilometers south, in the stone halls of the way station where Reverend Mother Mohayim had first received her troubling vision, a very different kind of quiet conversation was taking place. Lady Jessica had traveled there under the careful pretext of consulting with her old teacher on matters of House Atreides security, a plausible cover, given the genuine uncertainty gripping every faction on Arrakis, and one that allowed the two Bene Gesserit women a private hour together the Sisterhood's council had specifically requested. "You understand," Mohayim said, once the door had sealed, and the room's privacy had been confirmed by the small, practiced habits of women who had spent lifetimes ensuring conversations remained where they were meant to remain, that the Sisterhood does not yet know what this being is. Our prescient sight finds only a wall where his future should be woven. Other memory offers nothing. 90 generations of careful breeding toward the Kwisatz Haderach have prepared us for many contingencies, Jessica, but not for a power that appears to exist entirely outside the pattern we have spent 3,000 years constructing. "You wish me to observe him," Jessica said. It was not a question. "I wish you to use whatever access your house's position affords you when the transition to Arrakis is complete, to learn what our own agents cannot yet determine from a safe distance." Mohayim's ancient eyes carried a weight Jessica had rarely seen in her old teacher, a fear dressed carefully in the language of institutional caution. Is he mortal, in any sense our Sisterhood's centuries of study would recognize? Can the voice affect him, should it ever come to that test? Does he operate from ambition, from duty, from something else entirely that our frameworks have no word for? The Sisterhood has survived 3,000 years by understanding the men who hold power before those men fully understand themselves. This one, Jessica, may not permit that particular advantage. I need you to find out, before the Sisterhood is forced to act against him blind. Jessica considered this in the particular stillness her training had built into her, decades of Bene Gesserit discipline holding her genuine unease beneath a composed surface. And if my observations confirm what the visions suggest, that he represents something the Sisterhood cannot steer, cannot breed toward, cannot fold into 90 generations of careful planning? Then, Mohayim said, and for just a moment the old woman's careful composure slipped enough to show the genuine fear beneath it, we will have learned, Jessica, after 3,000 years of believing ourselves the quiet architects of this empire's future, that there are pieces on this board we did not place and cannot remove. House Atreides' transition to Arrakis arrived on schedule, in the deliberate, ceremonial fashion the Landsraad's ancient protocols demanded. Duke Leto's own frigate descending through Arrakine's shimmering shield perimeter, while the departing Harkonnen garrison withdrew its equipment, and its bitterness in equal grudging measure, the entire changeover watched by Imperial observers, whose formal presence made certain that neither house deviated from the letter of the Emperor's ruling, whatever either house privately felt about it. Vader watched the transition from a discreet vantage the Baron's household had arranged, at his own quiet insistence, on the pretext of assessing the new administration's disposition toward existing arrangements. In truth, he had wanted to see Duke Leto Atreides with his own eyes before any formal contact occurred between them, to read, in the man's bearing and his household's discipline, what kind of adversary or ally this Duke might prove to be. What he saw surprised him, in a way few things on this strange desert world had yet managed to. Leto Atreides moved among his own household guard not as a distant, untouchable authority, but as a commander who knew his men's names, who paused to speak with a groundskeeper about the transition's logistics with the same attention he gave his senior officers, whose bearing carried a quiet, exhausted dignity that reminded Vader, uncomfortably, of officers he had once served beside in another lifetime, before the Clone Wars had taught him that decency and survival were rarely compatible virtues in men who commanded armies. He filed the observation away with the others, unresolved. A duke who governed through respect rather than fear was either a fool who would not survive this planet's realities, or something considerably more dangerous than the Baron's crude, greed-tempered cruelty, a leader capable of commanding genuine loyalty, which was, in Vader's long experience, worth considerably more than any army raised through terror alone. The formal contact, when it came, arrived through channels considerably more careful than the Barons had been. Duke Leto did not summon Vader to an audience, understanding, through Hawat's careful counsel and his own instinctive read of the reports reaching him, that summoning a being who had reportedly wounded a sandworm and stopped lasgun fire in mid-air was precisely the kind of gesture likely to provoke exactly the confrontation House Atreides could least afford in its first fragile weeks on a hostile new fief. Instead, he sent an invitation, carried by Gurney Halleck under careful diplomatic protocol, phrased with the particular precision of a man who had learned, across a lifetime of Landsraad politics, that the exact wording of an approach to an unknown power could mean the difference between a useful ally and a catastrophic enemy. Duke Leto Atreides extends his respect to a stranger arrived upon Arrakis under circumstances none of us yet fully understand, and requests, at whatever time and place proves convenient, the honor of a conversation between equals, not petitioner to lord, nor lord to petitioner, but two powers, seeking to understand the shape of a world they must now both, in their own ways, learn to survive. Vader read the message twice, turning over its careful diplomatic architecture with the same attention he brought to every calculation. It was, he recognized, an approach considerably more sophisticated than the Baron's crude offer of patronage as leash, an invitation that assumed nothing, demanded nothing, and offered, in its very phrasing, an acknowledgement of Vader's independence that the Baron had never once genuinely extended. He agreed to the meeting, not out of any particular warmth toward House Atreides. He had not yet decided whether this Duke's quiet dignity concealed genuine strength or simply a weakness dressed in more attractive robes than the Baron's, but because a Duke capable of writing an invitation this carefully calibrated was a Duke worth assessing directly, on Vader's own terms, before any conflict between them became inevitable rather than chosen. They met in a modest chamber in Arakin's new Atreides residence, stripped of the Baron's cold ostentation, furnished instead with the practical, unadorned dignity that seemed to characterize everything Leto Atreides touched. No 40 armed guards arrayed for theater, no suspensor couch designed to project unconcern. Just the Duke himself, standing, with Thufir Hawat a careful pace behind him, and Gurney Halleck a pace behind that, and across the room, Lady Jessica seated with the deliberate Bene Gesserit stillness of a woman who had been given, by her sisterhood's counsel, a very specific assignment she had no intention of revealing through so much as a flicker of expression. "Lord Vader," Leto said, and there was no theater in the greeting, no oiled false warmth, simply the direct, measured courtesy of one leader addressing another. "I confess I do not know the correct title for a man in your position. I am given to understand you did not come to this world seeking a throne." "I did not come to this world at all, Duke Atreides," Vader said. "I was brought here, by circumstances I have not yet fully unraveled, from a place considerably farther away than any distance your guild's navigators measure in their folded paths. What I do with the time I spend here remains, as yet, undecided." "Then perhaps," Leto said, "that undecided quality is precisely what concerns every faction currently watching you, myself included, though I would rather discuss the matter directly than through the considerably less accurate lens of rumor and fear that has, I am told, gripped half of Carthag's garrison since your arrival. Something in the directness of it, the plain, unadorned honesty of a man laying his concern openly on the table rather than wrapping it in a baron's oily flattery or an emperor's distant calculation, earned, for the first time since Vader's arrival on this world, something that was not quite respect but sat adjacent to it. "You wish to know whether I intend to threaten your house," Vader said. "I wish to know," Leto said, "what you actually want, Lord Vader, not what the Baron wants of you, or what the Emperor's observers report to Kaitain, or what the Bene Gesserit's prescient sight fears about you. I have found, across a life spent navigating the Landsraad's endless intrigue, that it is generally more useful to ask a man directly what he wants than to spend a decade guessing at it through intermediaries who each have their own reasons to lie." Vader was quiet for a long moment, A silence that stretched long enough that Gurney Halleck's hand drifted, fractionally, toward the hilt of his own weapon, though Hawat's raised palm stilled the gesture before it completed. "I have ruled an empire that spanned a galaxy, Duke Atreides," Vader said finally, and something in the flat mechanical voice carried, for the first time since his arrival, a weight that was not quite threat and not quite confession, but something uneasily between the two. "I served before that, a cause I believed just, until I learned, at considerable cost, in ways I do not intend to discuss with a man I have known for the length of a single conversation, that the men I trusted to define justice had been lying to me since before I was old enough to recognize the lie. What I want, Duke Atreides, is what I have wanted since I woke in a crater of glass on your desert world 9 days ago, to understand the true shape of the board before I commit myself to a peace on it. I have been offered patronage by a baron who wished to use me as a threat against you. I have not yet decided whether House Atreides deserves better than that offer, or merely different terms of the same essential arrangement." Leto absorbed this with the particular grave attention of a man who understood, better than most, what it meant to have once served a cause that had ultimately betrayed him. His own house's long, careful independence from imperial favor had been built on exactly that hard-won wisdom. "Then let me offer you something the Baron did not, and could not, Lord Vader. Not patronage, not a leash dressed as generosity. I offer you the same thing I offer every soul under my house's protection who proves themselves worthy of the offer in turn. A place among equals, judged by your actions rather than your origins, for as long as those actions merit the trust. Nothing more, and, I would ask you to understand this clearly, nothing less." It was, Vader recognized, an offer built on a foundation entirely unlike anything Palpatine had ever extended him, and entirely unlike the Baron's crude leash as well. An offer of genuine partnership from a man who seemed, against every instinct 20 years of Imperial service had built into Vader's judgment, to actually mean it. He did not accept immediately. He had learned, at catastrophic cost, the price of accepting the wrong offer from the wrong man too quickly. "I will consider your offer, Duke Atreides," he said, with more genuine attention than I gave the Baron's. "That is, for now, the most honest answer I can give you." It was. Leto understood, watching the black-armored figure depart his modest chamber, with that same unhurried, patient wait, considerably more than he had privately hoped to secure from a single first conversation, and considerably less than the certainty he badly needed, with a baron's wounded pride and an emperor's distant calculation, both still circling this fragile new arrangement, like sharks testing unfamiliar water. That night, in the quiet hour before the household retired, Paul found his mother alone in the residence's east garden, tending, with the particular focused stillness she brought to every task, a small transplanted patch of Caladan greenery that had somehow survived the journey to this desert world. "You watched him today," Paul said. "In the chamber, during Father's meeting, I saw you." Jessica did not look up from the plants immediately. "I was asked to observe him, Paul, by my sisterhood, and by your father both, for reasons that happen, for once, to align." "What did you see?" She was quiet for a long moment, her hands still among the leaves. "I saw a man," she said finally, "who has done things he is not at peace with, carrying a weight I do not think any Bene Gesserit training has ever prepared me to properly measure. And I saw something else, Paul, that concerns me considerably more than anything my sisterhood's council has yet put into words." She looked up now, and her composed Bene Gesserit stillness could not quite disguise the genuine unease beneath it. "I could not read him, not fully. Every trained faculty my sisterhood spent decades building into me, the small tells, the involuntary physical signals that reveal a man's true intent beneath his words, found almost nothing to work with. As though whatever taught him to master himself was built on a foundation considerably more absolute than anything our own training provides. Paul considered this, his young face carrying, in the pale double moonlight, an expression considerably older than his years. "I dreamed of him again last night," he said quietly. "Not clearly, never clearly, with him. But I saw sand, and a red door, and behind it," he stopped, searching for words his prescient sight had not yet given him, and would not, for some time yet, fully resolve into anything he could confidently name. I don't think the future decides what to do with him yet, Mother. I think, somehow, he decides what to do with the future instead. Jessica said nothing to this for a long moment, looking at her son with an expression that mixed a mother's pride and a Bene Gesserit's calculation in proportions she herself could not have easily separated. Then she returned to her plants, and the quiet Caladan garden, transplanted so far from home, held its fragile green silence a while longer beneath Arrakis's strange and watchful stars. Word of the meeting between Duke Leto and the black-armored stranger reached Carthage within 2 days. Carried by the same porous network of merchants and off-world traders that had first spread news of the crater, and it reached the Baron in a form that curdled his earlier caution into something considerably sharper. They spoke as equals, the Baron said, his voice climbing toward the particular pitch Peter de Vries had learned, across years of service, to recognize as the leading edge of a genuine Harkonnen rage. Equals, Peter. After I housed him, fed him, offered him resources beyond anything a stranded man in a desert crater had any right to expect, and he repays my hospitality by sitting down with Leto Atreides as though the two of them were old friends comparing notes on the weather. My Baron, if I may, you may not. The Baron's suspensor couch trembled faintly as its occupant's considerable bulk shifted with an agitation he rarely permitted himself to display openly. I want to know what was discussed in that chamber. Every word, if your agents can manage it. And I want— He paused, and something in his small, cruel eyes sharpened into a calculation considerably colder than his earlier greed had allowed for. I want a contingency, Peter. If this creature has decided House Atreides deserves his talents more than House Harkonnen does, then House Harkonnen requires a plan that does not depend on his continued cooperation at all. De Vries considered this with his particular mentat stillness, already turning the problem over through the layered calculations his training demanded. The Emperor Sardaukar remained the only conventional force in this empire capable of fielding numbers sufficient to matter against a single target of this magnitude, my Baron, and even that assumes numbers alone would prove sufficient, which the evidence available to us does not currently support. A more prudent approach might involve— I did not ask for prudence, Peter. I asked for a contingency? The Baron's voice had gone very quiet now, which those who knew him best understood to be considerably more dangerous than his shouting. Send word to Catane, discreetly. I want to know whether the Emperor's own interest in this matter has progressed beyond Count Fenring's polite observation. And send word, as well, to our contacts among the Tleilaxu. If conventional force will not suffice against this creature, perhaps a more specialized solution exists. A toxin, a binding, something that does not require an army to deploy, only patience and the correct application. De Vries bowed and withdrew to compose the necessary correspondence, privately calculating, with the cold, clear-eyed precision his training demanded even of thoughts he found personally troubling, the probability that any Tleilaxu solution the Baron might purchase would prove effective against a being who had, by every credible report reaching Carthage, absorbed a sandworm's full strike without so much as a stumble. The probability, by his own careful reckoning, was not favorable. He composed the correspondence anyway. It was, after all, his duty. 300 kilometers south, in Sietch Tabor, Stilgar convened the council he had promised Farok he would eventually call. Once enough careful, patient watching had accumulated into something worth a full Sietch's deliberation. The chamber was smaller than the grand halls of Carthage or Arrakis, carved directly from living rock, lit by the warm amber glow of glow globes rather than suspensor lights, and filled with a different kind of authority entirely. Not the theatrical power of a baron's suspensor couch or an emperor's golden throne, but the hard-earned authority of men and women who had survived a planet that offered nothing to anyone who had not proven themselves against its every cruelty. 3 watchers have now confirmed the account, Stilgar said, addressing the gathered naibs and Sietch elders with the careful, measured cadence the matter demanded. He does not hide from the sun as the off-worlders do, though it clearly costs him something to endure it. We have watched him limit his time in the open desert during the hottest hours. which suggests he is not immune to Arrakis' cruelty, merely more capable of enduring it than any off-worlder we have encountered before. He wounded Shai-Hulud and lived. He speaks to the Harkonnens with contempt they have not dared answer, and now, we are told, he has met with the new Duke as an equal rather than a subject. The old prophecies speak of a voice from the outer world, said an elder woman named Ramallo, one of the Sietch's respected truth-tellers, her ancient eyes carrying the particular weight of a woman who had spent a long life balancing genuine faith against hard-won Fremen practicality. Lisan al-Gaib. Some among the younger generation already whisper the name in connection with this stranger Stilgar. Whatever caution you have urged upon them, I have urged caution precisely because I do not yet know whether the whisper deserves to become belief, Stilgar said. The Missionaria Protectiva planted those old prophecies among our ancestors generations ago for reasons that served the Outworlders' purposes considerably more than they ever served ours. I will not commit this Sietch's faith to a stranger merely because his arrival happens to rhyme with a story planted in our grandmothers' grandmothers by off-world priests with their own agenda. He paused, and something in his weathered face carried genuine, unresolved uncertainty. A rare admission, from a naib whose authority depended on projecting certainty, even when he privately felt none. But I will not dismiss him either, a being who fights Shai-Hulud and survives, who shows the desert enough respect to limit his exposure during the killing hours despite whatever strength his armor provides him, who speaks to Harkonnen and Atreides both as though their thrones were beneath his true concern. That is not a man to be dismissed as mere off-world rumor. That is a man to be understood, carefully, before this Sietch decides what he means for us. And if he proves a threat rather than a prophecy, ask another naib, a hard-eyed man named Shadout Mape's own kin, voicing the question every practical Fremen in the chamber had been quietly weighing since Farok's first report reached them. Then we will do what Fremen have always done against threats too large to face directly, Stilgar said. We will watch and wait and let the desert itself judge whether he belongs here before we commit our own water to the question. He looked around the chamber, meeting each naib's eyes in turn with the particular gravity of a leader asking his people for patience in a matter that touched, however obliquely, on the deepest currents of their faith. For now we continue as we have, quiet eyes on Carthag, quiet eyes on the new Duke's residence in Arrakis, and no contact of our own. Let the off-worlders test him first, and learn from their mistakes, before Sietch Tabr decides whether to test him ourselves. The council murmured its assent, and the meeting dissolved into the Sietch's ordinary evening rhythms, the careful reclamation of moisture from the day's activities, the quiet domestic business of a community that had survived 1,000 years of Arrakis' cruelty through discipline that never once relaxed its vigilance, even in matters as strange and unprecedented as a black-armored stranger who fought worm gods and walked away. Stilgar remained a while longer in the emptying council chamber, alone with the amber glow of the glow globes and a private uncertainty he had not fully shared even with his own gathered naibs, a nagging, unresolved suspicion that whatever Sietch Tabr decided about this stranger, the decision itself might matter considerably less than the stranger's own decision about them, whenever that decision finally came. In Arrakis that same evening, Duke Leto received a report from Thufir Hawat that confirmed, with the particular grim precision of a Mentat's careful intelligence work, exactly the fear Leto had privately carried since his conversation with Vader 4 days before. The Baron has sent inquiries to Kaitain, Hawat said, and separately, through channels considerably less savory, to contacts among the Tleilaxu. My lord, I believe House Harkonnen intends to seek some manner of specialized solution against Lord Vader, having concluded that conventional force and continued hospitality have both failed to secure his cooperation. A toxin, Leto said slowly, or a binding of some kind. That would be my assessment, my lord, yes. Leto absorbed this in silence for a long moment, standing at the same map table where he had first received word of the crater 9 days before, though the map beneath his hands had grown considerably more complicated since. New lines marking Fremen Sietch's his own intelligence network had only begun to properly chart. New annotations tracking Spice Basin yields his house now bore responsibility for, and at the center of it all, an unresolved variable in black armor, whose true loyalties remained, even after their careful first meeting, genuinely uncertain. If the Baron succeeds in poisoning him, or binding him, or however he intends to neutralize a being that has already survived a sandworm's direct strike, Leto said finally, then House Harkonnen will have removed the single most unpredictable element currently complicating this transition, and will very likely believe itself owed considerable imperial gratitude for the service, whatever the actual cost of the attempt. And if the Baron fails, my lord? Then, Leto said, and something in his weathered, exhausted face carried the particular weight of a duke who had spent a lifetime learning to recognize the precise moment when careful diplomacy stopped being sufficient on its own. I suspect House Harkonnen will have given Lord Vader every reason he needs to conclude that Arrakis's existing power structures are not worth preserving at all, Atreides included, unless we take considerable care to ensure he understands the distinction between a Baron's treachery and our own house's genuine offer of partnership. He looked up at Hawat with the particular grave resolve that had, across a difficult life, earned him the loyalty of men considerably harder to win over than his enemies ever gave him credit for. Send word to Lord Vader, Thufir, discreetly, and through whatever channel he will find least presumptuous. Whatever the Baron intends against him, I would rather he learn of the danger from a genuine ally than discover it only after the poison has already been administered. Duke Leto's warning reached Vader through a channel considerably more direct than diplomatic protocol strictly demanded, not a formal message carried by a Atreides herald, which would have drawn immediately visible attention from the Baron's own intelligence network, but a quiet word passed by a Fremen waterseller who had, unknown to either house, long served as one of C.H. Taber's most reliable conduits into Carthag's markets, and who had been quietly retained, through careful arrangement, to also serve House Atreides' own growing intelligence reach. The message was simple, unsigned, and precise. The Baron has sought a specialist solution against you, of a kind that does not announce itself through conventional means. A friend advises caution regarding anything ingested, inhaled, or touched, until the nature of the threat is better understood. Vader received the warning with the flat, unsurprised patience of a man who had spent 20 years surrounded by subordinates and rivals alike who each, in their own time, had concluded that his removal would serve their ambitions. He had, in fact, already suspected something of the kind. The Baron's household had grown subtly more solicitous over the past 3 days, small courtesies offered with a warmth that did not quite match the wary calculation Vader had learned to read in every Harkonnen face since his arrival. A vial of unusually fine, spice-laced wine, offered as a gesture of continued goodwill. A change of quarters to a chamber the household staff described as better suited to his comfort, located, Vader noted upon inspection, considerably closer to the garrison's environmental systems than his previous rooms. He had touched none of it. He touched none of it now either, though he allowed the household to believe, for 3 additional days, that their solicitous gestures were being received exactly as intended, a small, patient deception that let him observe, with mounting confirmation, precisely how far the Baron's contingency planning had progressed. The attempt itself came on the 13th night since the crater, delivered not through the wine or the environmental systems, both of which Vader had quietly neutralized through means the Baron's household never detected, but through a considerably more direct channel. 3 Tleilaxu-trained operatives, faces subtly altered through the twisted arts of their master's genetic manipulation, to pass unremarked among the garrison's regular staff, who entered his quarters in the deep hours of the night, carrying a needle-fine injector loaded with a toxin the Tleilaxu had spent considerable resources developing specifically for this contract. A compound designed, according to the careful specifications the Baron's gold had purchased, to disrupt neural function in beings of even extraordinary physical resilience, on the theory that a creature capable of surviving a sandworm strike might nonetheless prove vulnerable to something that attacked the mind rather than the body. They found him waiting. He had felt them coming through the force long before they reached his door, Three distinct presences moving with the particular controlled tension of trained killers, radiating an intent that needed no words to translate. He did not raise an alarm. He did not attempt to flee a confrontation he had, in truth, been quietly anticipating since the warning first reached him 3 days before. He simply waited, standing in the dark of his quarters with the patient stillness of a predator, considerably more practiced at this particular game than the men now creeping toward his door believed possible. And when the door opened and the first operative crossed the threshold with the injector raised, Vader's hand rose in the same slow, unhurried gesture that had once stopped 6 lasgun bolts in midair on his first night in this desert. The operative's throat closed around a breath that would not come. His companions, a half-step behind him in the darkened corridor, froze at the sight of their comrade rising slowly off his feet, boots leaving the floor, hands clawing uselessly at a throat no visible force constricted. And in the half-second before either of them could retreat or raise a weapon of their own, Vader's other hand completed the gesture, and the first operative's neck broke with a sound that seemed, in the quiet of that room, considerably louder than it should have been. The second and third operatives did not survive their attempt to flee. Vader did not chase them through the corridors, did not raise a general alarm that would have woken the garrison. He simply reached out, through a force that answered him here, on this world, exactly as it always had, and ended the pursuit before either man had covered 10 meters of hallway, their bodies found the following morning by a garrison staff that would spend the rest of that week in a state of quiet, superstitious dread they did not dare voice aloud to their Baron. The Baron received the news at dawn, delivered by a visibly shaken Piter de Vries, and understood, in the cold clarity of the moment, precisely how thoroughly his contingency had failed, and precisely what that failure now meant for House Harkonnen's continued position on Arrakis. "He knows," de Vries said, his mentat composure fraying at its edges for the first time in Peter de Vries's long service to House Harkonnen. "My Baron, he knew they were coming, long before they reached his door. 3 of our most capable operatives, trained specifically for this contract, and he ended all 3 without so much as raising his voice loud enough to wake the garrison." The Baron said nothing for a long moment, his considerable bulk very still upon his suspensor couch, his small eyes fixed on some middle distance while the full weight of the miscalculation settled over him. He had gambled his house's uneasy arrangement with the single most dangerous being to enter this empire in living memory, and lost the gamble entirely, and now faced the very real prospect that the being in question would conclude, correctly, that House Harkonnen's hospitality had been, from the very beginning, a slower and more patient version of the same crude threat the Baron's earlier offer had represented. "Prepare the garrison," the Baron said finally, his voice carrying none of its usual oiled confidence. Full alert, and Piter, he looked up, and something in his cruel, frightened eyes carried a resignation he rarely permitted himself to show even his most trusted mentat. "Send word to Kaitain immediately. Whatever happens here in the next hours, I want the Emperor to hear it from us first, before rumor carries a considerably less flattering version of events to the throne ahead of our own account." Vader found the Baron in the same cold stone hall where their first audience had taken place, 13 days before, and this time the Baron did not recline upon his suspensor couch with theatrical unconcern. He stood, or rather, his suspensor belts held him upright at an angle that approximated standing, his considerable bulk trembling with a fear he no longer had the composure to disguise, flanked by a garrison guard that both men understood, with equal clarity, would accomplish nothing at all if the confrontation turned to violence. "You sent 3 men to kill me in my sleep," Vader said, and the flat, mechanical weight of the words carried none of the theatrical menace the moment might have called for in a lesser confrontation, only the cold, absolute certainty of a verdict already rendered. "After 13 days of hospitality extended, by your own account, in good faith, after I declined your request to threaten House Atreides on your behalf, out of a restraint you evidently mistook for weakness rather than the considered judgment of a man withholding violence he did not yet believe the situation required." "A misunderstanding," the Baron began, and stopped, because even a man of his considerable and long-practiced dishonesty understood, looking at the black-armored figure before him, that no lie constructed in this moment would carry any weight at all. I have spent 20 years serving an empire built on precisely this kind of calculation, Baron, Vader said. Men who smiled and offered hospitality and struck the moment they believed the striking would cost them nothing. I recognize the pattern considerably better than you appear to have anticipated. He took a step forward, and the garrison guards arrayed around the hall's edges, 40 strong as they had been on that first night, made no move at all to intervene, because every one of them had, by now, heard exactly what had happened to 3 of Carthag's most capable operatives in the deep hours of the previous night, and understood, with the particular clarity fear provides, precisely how little their own numbers would accomplish should this confrontation turn to open violence. I did not come to this world to serve House Harkonnen's ambitions, Vader continued, and I extended you considerably more patience than your own conduct has earned, in the interest of understanding this empire's true shape before committing myself to any side of its conflicts. That patience is now spent. House Harkonnen's hospitality has revealed itself to be exactly what it always was beneath its oiled surface, and I do not extend a second chance to men who have already shown me, with considerable clarity, precisely what they intend the moment they believe themselves capable of it. The Baron's small eyes, for the first time in 13 days, carried genuine, undisguised terror. What do you intend? I intend to leave your city, Baron, and I intend to leave you alive to explain this failure to your emperor yourself, because your death would accomplish considerably less than your survival as a walking demonstration of what happens to men who mistake my restraint for an opportunity. Vader's mask tilted, and something in the gesture carried a weight considerably colder than any threat he had voiced so far. Consider this mercy a debt, Baron. I do not expect you will find occasion to repay it kindly, but I would advise you, with genuine sincerity, not to test whether I extend it twice. He left the hall without waiting for a response, his cape settling behind him with the same unhurried weight it had carried through every confrontation since the crater cooled, and behind him, in the cold stone hall that had hosted his first uneasy audience with this world's ordinary cruelty, Baron Vladimir Harkonnen sat very still upon his trembling suspensor couch, and began, for the first time in a long and cruel life built on the assumption that he was always the most dangerous man in any room he occupied, to seriously consider the possibility that House Harkonnen's long, brutal stewardship of Arrakis's spice wealth might be drawing, through his own catastrophic miscalculation, toward a considerably earlier end than any Landsraad ruling had ever threatened to impose. Vader left Carthag on foot, alone, walking out through the city's northern gate into open desert with the same unhurried patience he had carried into that city 13 days before, and this time no Harkonnen escort trailed behind him, because no one in Carthag's garrison had volunteered for the duty, and the Baron had not, in the end, insisted. He did not walk toward Arrakis directly. He had turned Leto Atreides' careful, genuine offer over in his mind through every hour of the assassination attempt's aftermath, and had concluded, with the same cold clarity that had once governed 2 decades of Imperial service, that a man who had warned him of danger through discreet channels, expecting nothing in return, deserved considerably more careful consideration than a hasty acceptance delivered in the heat of a Harkonnen betrayal. He would go to Duke Leto. But first he intended to see more of this desert that had swallowed him whole, on his own terms, before he committed himself to any faction's particular vision of what he ought to become here. He walked 3 days through the deep erg, sustained by his suit's own considerable resources and a discipline that had carried him through worse deprivation than an alien desert's brutal heat. And on the evening of the 3rd day, as the twin suns dropped toward a horizon stained the color of old blood, he became aware, through the force's thick, reluctant currents, and through a mundane physical awareness his years of war had honed just as sharply, that he was being watched, not pursued. Watched, with the patient, disciplined restraint of professionals who understood exactly how dangerous their quarry might prove, and had no intention of revealing themselves before they had gathered whatever additional information their approach required. He stopped walking, in the lee of a dune whose crest cast a long blue shadow across the cooling sand, and spoke into the empty air with the flat, unhurried certainty of a man entirely confident in his own perception. You have watched me for the better part of an hour. I would prefer conversation to further surveillance, if you have come to offer either." For a long moment nothing answered but the wind, sighing faintly across the dune's crest and carrying, on its edge, the faint cinnamon-sharp scent Vader had come, over 13 days, to associate with this entire strange world. Then, from the shadow of a rock outcrop he had noted but not flagged as a threat, 3 figures rose, desert-robed, moving with a fluid, economical grace that spoke of a discipline entirely different from the Harkonnen garrison's trained but comparatively clumsy soldiers, faces mostly hidden behind the fine mesh of stillsuit hoods, eyes catching the last of the dying light with the particular deep blue within blue that marked a lifetime's exposure to spice. "You have good ears, off-worlder," said the foremost of the 3, a broad-shouldered man whose bearing carried unmistakable authority even through the concealment of his desert robes. "Or good instincts. Few outworlders notice a Fremen watch until the watch is finished and the decision already made. I have had considerable practice noticing things that wish to remain unnoticed," Vader said. "You are Fremen. I have heard the garrison speak of your people with more genuine fear than they extend to any great house's rival army. And we have heard of you," the Fremen said, "though what we have heard does not entirely agree with what I see standing before me now." His deep blue eyes traveled the length of the black armor with an assessment considerably less crude than the Baron's had been, and considerably more informed, the careful appraisal of a man who had, Vader now understood, likely watched this very desert from a concealed distance during the sandworm encounter 13 days before. "You fought Shai-Hulud, and lived, and the worm fled rather than press its attack a second time. That is not a small thing on this world, off-worlder. That is not a thing my people forget easily, whatever we decide to make of it. I did not seek the fight," Vader said. "It found me, as this world has found a great many things about me that I did not volunteer, perhaps." The Fremen's expression, what little of it showed above the stillsuit mesh, carried an unreadable weight. "I am Stilgar, Naib of Sietch Tabr. I have come to see for myself what my scouts have reported, before my people decide what your presence on our desert is meant to signify. Whether you are the fulfillment of an old prophecy some among us already whisper your name into, or merely a powerful and dangerous stranger who happens, by chance alone, to have arrived in a manner that rhymes with an old story planted among us by outworld priests for their own purposes generations ago. I have no interest in fulfilling anyone's prophecy, Stilgar of Sietch Tabr," Vader said, and something in the flat honesty of the statement seemed to carry more weight with the Fremen Naim than any grander claim might have managed. "I did not come to this world seeking to be worshipped. I came here, was brought here, against my own will and understanding, and I have spent 13 days attempting to determine what, if anything, this world requires of me, and what I require of it in return." "And what have you determined?" Vader considered the question with the same patient weight he had given every calculation since the crater cooled around him. "That your desert does not offer its respect freely, to anyone, human or otherwise. That the great houses squabbling over its spice wealth understand considerably less about the true nature of what they are fighting over than they believe they do. And that your people, Stilgar, survive here through a discipline I recognize, because I once commanded soldiers who were asked to master exactly that same unforgiving arithmetic, endure or die, with no comfortable middle ground offered to the weak." Stilgar was quiet for a long moment, studying the black-armored figure with the particular deep, unhurried attention Fremen reserved for judgments too important to rush. "You speak differently than the outworlders who have come to this desert before you," he said finally. "The Harkonnen speak of Arrakis as a resource to be bled. The new Duke speaks of it, from what little we have gathered, as a fief to be governed with more care than his predecessors extended it, though we have not yet decided whether that care is genuine or merely a subtler form of the same old extraction." His eyes, deep blue within deep blue, held Vader's masked gaze without flinching. "You speak of it as something to be understood before it is claimed. That is a rarer thing among outworlders than you perhaps realize." "I have claimed things before without understanding them first," Vader said, and something in the mechanical flatness of the admission carried a weight that surprised even himself, an honesty he had not extended to the Baron, or fully to Duke Leto either, in either of their careful negotiations. It did not end well, for me, or for the things I claimed. I do not intend to repeat that particular failure on a world that has already demonstrated, through Shai-Hulud alone, that it does not tolerate ignorance kindly. Stilgar exchanged a glance with his two companions, a silent, wordless communication built on years of shared discipline, and something in that exchange seemed to settle a question the three of them had carried into this encounter without fully voicing it aloud. C.H. Tauber does not extend trust easily, off-worlder, Stilgar said finally. Not to Harkonnen, not to Atreides, not to Emperor's men, and not, whatever certain of my people already whisper, to a stranger who fights worm gods and walks the desert alone. But we do not close a door before we have seen what stands on the other side of it either. He inclined his head, a gesture that carried, Vader sensed, considerably more formal weight among these people than its outward simplicity suggested. Come to C.H. Tauber, if you wish it. See how my people survive this desert you claim to respect. And then, perhaps, we will both better understand what your presence here is meant to signify, to my people, and to the Empire both. It was, Vader recognized, an invitation built on an entirely different foundation than either the Baron's crude leash or even Duke Leto's careful, genuine offer of partnership. Not power extended, not patronage offered, but a chance to earn something considerably rarer on this world, the trust of the one people who had survived Arrakis on its own terms, for 1,000 years, without ever once needing a great house's protection to do it. I will come, Vader said, on the condition that I come as an observer first, and a potential ally second, exactly as I extended Duke Atreides. I have already learned, at considerable cost during my brief time in Carthage, what becomes of arrangements built on assumptions rather than earned understanding. Stilgar's expression, beneath the stillsuit mesh, carried something that might, in a harder man, have passed for the beginning of respect. Then you have already learned more of this desert's true lesson, off-worlder, than most who come to it ever manage across a full lifetime spent bleeding it for its wealth. He turned, gesturing toward the darkening dunes rolling away toward the horizon, where the first of the evening's cold stars had begun to prick through the deepening violet sky. C.H. Tauber is 3 days' walk from here, by the route that avoids Shai-Hulud's deepest territories. Walk with us, and see for yourself what the desert has already taught my people, across 1,000 years, about surviving on terms considerably harder than any your empire ever asked of you. Vader fell into step beside the three Fremen as they turned south, into the gathering dark, and behind them, unseen and unremarked in the vast cooling silence of the Urg, the deep sand held its own patient, ancient awareness, 10,000 years of accumulated territorial memory, spanning every worm in the deep desert, carrying forward the dim, persistent knowledge that something new walked among them now, that had tested Shai-Hulud once and not been found wanting, and that the desert itself, in its own vast and unhurried fashion, had not yet finished deciding what to make of him either. The 3 days' walk to C.H. Tauber taught Vader more about Arrakis than his previous 13 combined. He watched the Fremen move through the deep Urg with an economy of motion that wasted nothing. Not a step, not a breath, not a single unnecessary word exchanged between them across long stretches of silent, disciplined travel. He watched Stilgar read worm sign in the shifting textures of distant sand, the way Vader himself might once have read the tactical displays aboard an Imperial Star Destroyer's bridge, translating subtle disturbances invisible to untrained eyes into precise, actionable intelligence about which routes remained safe and which had become, in the last hour alone, a hunting ground for something vast and patient moving beneath the surface. He watched them ration water with a discipline that bordered on religious devotion, understanding, by the second day, that the strange tubes and reclamation systems built into their stillsuits represented not mere technology, but an entire civilization's hard-won answer to a planet that offered nothing freely to anyone unwilling to master its cruelty completely. He said little during the walk, and the Fremen, in turn, extended him a silence that was not unfriendly, but carried its own careful, evaluating weight. 3 people and 1 stranger from beyond the stars, walking together through a landscape that tested all of them equally, whatever the difference in their origins. It was on the evening of the second day, as the party paused in the lee of a rock formation to wait out the worst of a building dust haze on the horizon, that Stilgar finally asked the question Vader had sensed building beneath the Naib's careful silence since their first encounter. "You spoke, when we met, of soldiers you once commanded," Stilgar said, crouched in the rock's shadow with the fluid economy that marked every Fremen movement, "and of a cause you believed just, until you learned otherwise. You have not said what became of that belief, or what it cost you to lose it." Vader was quiet for a long moment, the dust haze building on the horizon casting the deepening evening in a strange ochre half-light. He had not spoken of Padme, of Obi-Wan, of the burning riverbank on Mustafar, or the mask that had become, across 20 years, less a prison than the only face he had left. Not to the Baron, not to Duke Leto, not to anyone on this strange desert world he had fallen into. But something in Stilgar's plain, unadorned directness, the same quality that had first made Duke Leto's offer feel different from the Baron's leash, made the question feel less like an intrusion and more like the natural continuation of an honesty Vader had, almost without deciding to, begun extending since the moment the three Fremen rose from behind their rock outcrop. "It cost me everything I believed I was fighting to protect," Vader said finally. "I trusted a man who called himself my friend, and my emperor, and he used that trust to turn me into an instrument of exactly the tyranny I believed I was fighting against. By the time I understood what I had become, the cost of undoing it was considerably higher than I was willing, or able, to pay." He paused, and something in the mechanical rasp of his breathing seemed, for a moment, to carry a weight heavier than mere air moving through a suit's filtration systems. "I do not tell you this seeking absolution, Stilgar. I tell you because you asked plainly, and I have found, across 13 days on this world, that plain honesty is rarer here than I expected, and considerably more valuable than the careful calculations every faction I have met so far seems determined to wrap around every word they offer me instead." Stilgar absorbed this in silence, his deep blue eyes reflecting the last dying light of the day's suns. "We have a saying among my people," he said finally. "The unspoken debt is heaviest. A man who names his failures plainly has already begun paying what he owes. A man who hides them pays nothing, and carries the weight forever regardless." He rose, testing the wind with the particular practiced attention of a man who had survived 1,000 small judgments the desert demanded of him across a long life. "The haze is passing. We should move before full dark. But I will tell you this, off-worlder, before we walk further. My people do not follow men because they claim greatness. We follow men who have already paid something real for the power they carry. You have begun to convince me you might be one of those, rather than merely another off-world lord grasping at a throne he has not yet earned the right to sit upon." They reached Sietch Tabor on the evening of the third day, descending through a narrow, carefully concealed rock passage into a vast cavern system that opened, deep within the shield wall's stone, into a warren of chambers, walkways, and cultivated moisture traps that represented, Vader understood immediately, an entire civilization built with a discipline his own empire's engineers would have found almost inconceivable. Every drop of water accounted for, every child taught from the earliest age the exact price the desert demanded for carelessness, an entire society organized, root to crown, around the singular, unforgiving arithmetic of survival. He was not greeted as a conqueror, nor as a prophet, though he caught, among the Sietch's watching eyes, as Stilgar led him through the warren's main gathering hall, the particular hushed uncertainty of a people who had not yet decided which of those categories, or some third possibility neither word quite captured, best described the black-armored stranger walking in their Naib's company. Stilgar brought him, that first evening, before the Sietch's assembled council, the same chamber where, 11 days before, Stilgar had first counseled his people toward patient watching rather than hasty judgment, and this time the deliberation was not about a distant rumor, but about the stranger standing directly among them, answering their questions with the same plain, unadorned honesty he had extended Stilgar during their desert crossing. "You could take what you wanted from us by force," said the elder Ramallo, her ancient eyes studying him with the particular weight of a woman who had spent a long life discerning true strength from its many counterfeits. "Water, shelter, whatever loyalty fear alone can compel from a people who have seen, by now, what you did to Shai-Hulud, and to 3 Harkonnen killers both. Why come to us instead as a supplicant, when the Empire's great houses have already shown you that force alone opens most doors on this world?" "Because force opens doors," Vader said, "but it does not build the things standing behind them. I ruled an empire once through exactly the arithmetic you describe, Ramallo of Sietch Tabr. Fear compelling obedience, obedience mistaken for loyalty, until the day the fear faltered, and the obedience evaporated with it, because nothing real had ever been built beneath the compulsion in the first place." He looked around the gathered council, weighing his next words with the same careful patience he had brought to every calculation since the crater cooled around him 22 days before. "I have found, on this world, a duke who offers partnership rather than a leash, and a people who have survived 1,000 years of this desert's cruelty. Through discipline, I recognize and respect. I did not come to Sietch Tabr to take what your empire's great houses have failed to take from you across 3 generations of trying. I came to learn whether something considerably rarer might be possible instead, an alliance built on earned trust, rather than the compelled obedience I have already tried, and already watched fail, once before." The council chamber held its silence for a long moment, the amber glow globes casting their warm, unwavering light across faces that carried, in varying measure, suspicion, cautious curiosity, and, in a few, particularly among the younger Fremen gathered at the chamber's edges, something considerably closer to hope than Stilgar's careful, patient counsel had thus far permitted the Sietch to openly express. "Then here is what Sietch Tabr offers in turn," Stilgar said, rising to address both his own council and the stranger standing among them with the particular formal weight the moment demanded. "Not worship, not the blind fealty an old prophecy might otherwise have compelled from lesser disciplined believers among us. We offer you what we have offered no outworlder in living memory, the chance to prove yourself among us, on the desert's own terms, exactly as every Fremen child must prove themselves before this Sietch extends its trust in full. Walk with us. Learn what we have to teach, of water discipline and worm sign, and the 1,000 small disciplines that have kept my people alive here since long before any emperor's ledger first drew a claim across this world's sand. And in return, when the day comes, as I suspect it will, given the shape of the board you have described to me across 3 days of honest walking, that Harkonnen or Carino or some power neither of us has yet named moves against this desert and its people in earnest, you will stand with us, as an ally who has earned his place among us, rather than a lord who merely claims it." Vader considered the offer with the same weight he had given the Baron's leash and Duke Leto's partnership, and found in it something neither of the previous two had quite managed to extend. Not power offered in exchange for loyalty, and not partnership offered between equals who had known each other mere days, but something closer to the discipline he had once. In a lifetime that felt increasingly distant with every day, this strange desert reshaped his understanding of what he wanted from the power he still, undeniably carried. The chance to earn a place through demonstrated worth, judged not by ambition or fear, but by the desert's own unforgiving and entirely honest arithmetic. "I accept," Vader said, and the words carried, for the first time since he had woken in a crater of fused glass 22 days before, something that was not calculation, and was not the patient assessment of a man still determining the shape of the board. It was, however cautiously extended, the beginning of a genuine choice, the first he had made on this world, or perhaps in a considerably longer stretch of his strange and difficult life, that was not shaped primarily by the cold arithmetic of power and survival, but by something closer to the plain, unadorned respect Stilgar's people had earned from him across 3 days of honest walking through a desert that judged everyone, off-worlder and Fremen alike, by exactly the same unforgiving and entirely fair standard. Outside the Sietch, in the deep cooling dark of the desert night, the twin moons climbed slowly over dunes that stretched, silent and patient, to every horizon, a world that had swallowed a stranger whole 22 days before, tested him against its oldest and most terrible guardian, watched him refuse a baron's leash and a mentat's poison alike, and had now, in its own vast and unhurried fashion, begun extending him something it offered to vanishingly few outworlders in all its long and brutal history, the chance to belong to it, on terms it alone had ever set, and that it alone would ultimately judge him worthy or unworthy of keeping. Far to the north, in Carthag's cold stone halls, a baron nursed his wounded pride and his mounting fear in equal measure. In Arrakis, a duke waited for word from a stranger whose answer, when it came, would reshape the fragile balance of his house's first difficult season on this new fief. On Kaitine, an emperor and his quiet, watchful observer weighed reports that grew stranger and more urgent by the week. On Wallach 9, a sisterhood 3,000 years in the careful making confronted, for the first time in its long history, a piece on the board it had not placed and could not remove. And in the deep sand beneath it all, ancient and patient and entirely its own, Arrakis kept its own counsel, and waited to see what its newest and strangest guest would ultimately become. 22 days after the crater cooled, Darth Vader stood at last on ground he had chosen for himself. Not the Baron's cold stone halls, offered as a leash disguised in hospitality's clothing. Not yet the Duke's careful partnership, genuine though it had proven to be, and still waiting, patiently, for an answer Vader now understood he would soon be ready to give. But the deep desert itself, Siege Tauber's warren of stone and water discipline, a people who had survived 1,000 years of Arrakis's unforgiving arithmetic without ever once bending it to comfort or convenience. He had come to this world with nothing but the armor on his back and a power that answered him still, thick and strange in this desert's alien currents, but never once absent, never once diminished. He had been offered fear dressed as generosity and had refused it. He had been offered honest partnership and had not yet decided whether he deserved to accept it fully. He had been offered, at last, the hardest and rarest gift this unforgiving world extended to anyone who walked its sand, the chance to earn something real, through discipline and demonstrated worth, rather than simply take what his considerable power made possible to seize. Whatever the Baron's fear, the Duke's cautious hope, the Bene Gesserit's unresolved dread, or the distant Emperor's watchful calculation, ultimately decided about the black-armored stranger who had fallen from an impossible sky into the heart of their empire. One thing had already become undeniable across every court and council, now turning its attention toward this single, unresolved variable. Arrakis had swallowed strangers before, and broken most of them against its cruelty within a season. This one, the desert itself seemed to have decided, was going to take considerably longer to break, if, in the end, it ever managed to break him at all.